In the summer of 1859, a man stepped off the eastbound train at Briar Glen Station carrying nothing but a leather-bound trunk, a cane carved from polished oak, and a letter of appointment from the township's small but proud school board. His name was Thaddeus Finch. He was lean, silver-haired, though barely past 40, and dressed in a manner more common to the lecture halls of New York than the dirt roads of an Indiana farming town. No one in Briar Glen had heard of him before. Yet when he spoke, even the most skeptical farmers found themselves standing a little straighter, listening more carefully, answering his questions as if trying to impress him. It had been 5 years since the town's old schoolhouse had closed, an aging, creaky structure nestled beside the chapel on Mulberry Hill. Too few teachers, too many children sent out to work the fields, and a growing disinterest in formal learning had turned the building into little more than a place to store unused hymnals and broken furniture. But the town council had recently voted to reopen it, spurred by a renewed desire to instill moral foundation in the next generation, especially with whispers of unrest and change brewing across the nation. The Reverend Orrin Bell, the longest-serving voice in the town's pulpit, had taken it upon himself to seek a teacher, not merely of letters, but of conscience. And in Mr. Thaddeus Finch, they believed they had found just that. His first meeting with the townsfolk took place on the porch of the community hall. He spoke softly, never raising his voice, yet no one missed a word. He thanked them for the honor of educating their children and offered a brief outline of his philosophy. Education, he said, was not only the imparting of facts, but the shaping of souls. Children should not simply memorize the laws of grammar or the rules of arithmetic. They should come to understand their own moral compass and learn to examine the choices they made, the thoughts they entertained, the motives they concealed, even from themselves. There was a pause after his speech, as if the townspeople weren't sure whether to clap or pray. The very next Monday, class began. By the end of the first week, parents were speaking of a strange new calm that had fallen over their homes. The children were quieter, more reflective. Some of them had begun asking questions at the dinner table, curious, almost unsettling questions. Had their fathers ever done something they regretted? Had their mothers ever been jealous or dishonest or unkind? Many dismissed these inquiries as signs of an inquisitive mind. But there was something different in how the children asked, not with the bold irreverence of youth, but with the serene precision of a person conducting a survey. What most parents did not know, what few even thought to ask, was that Mr. Finch had begun each morning with a ritual he called reflections. In a calm voice, he invited each student to take a clean sheet of lined paper, head it with the words "confession of thought," and write without hesitation or filter, not simply what they had done, but what they had considered doing, what they had dreamed, what they feared others might discover about them. These pages were placed in a locked wooden box on Mr. Finch's desk, never to be read aloud or returned. This is a space of moral honesty, he had told them. You are not punished for your thoughts here. You are only punished for refusing to examine them. At first, many children were reluctant, but Mr. Finch had a way of speaking that made resistance feel like cowardice. He praised not obedience, but courage, the courage to face one's own shadow. And when praise came, it came so sincerely, so precisely that it intoxicated. By the second week, every student was writing their confession of thought without needing to be asked. Some wrote more than once a day. Dr. Seth Marlin, the town physician, was among the few adults who watched Finch with quiet unease. He lived 3 houses down from the schoolhouse and often walked past it on his way to visit patients. He had noticed how students who once played tag during recess now stood talking in pairs, eyes scanning one another, expressions unreadable. He had noticed, too, that Finch rarely left the school building. At night, the windows glowed with lamplight long after the children had gone home. It wasn't until late September that the first fracture in the town appeared. A boy named Eli Harper, 10 years old, curly-haired and wide-eyed, came home early from school one Friday and asked his mother a strange question. He wanted to know whether it was sinful that his father sometimes spent the night in the barn. Not because of work, Eli said, but because his mother cried too loudly when they argued. Mrs. Harper froze. She asked Eli where he had heard that. He simply said, "I thought it during reflection, and Mr. Finch asked me to write more about it." That night, Eli's parents argued again. Only this time, it was not about money or farmhands. It was about Mr. Finch. By Sunday, word had spread quietly, indirectly. Mothers whispered to one another at the general store. Fathers lingered longer at the blacksmith's forge. Some spoke in favor of the new teacher's methods. After all, weren't their children better behaved? Weren't they praying more, asking deeper questions, reading their Bibles with renewed interest? But others sensed something more, something colder, less about faith and more about control. Still, no one acted. Not yet. The first disappearance wouldn't come until October. If stories like this fascinate you, if the quiet unraveling of good towns by intelligent men makes your skin crawl the way it does mine, consider subscribing for more stories like this one. And tell us in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from people across the country, but do stay with us. The story of Mr. Finch and his quiet conquest of Briar Glen is only beginning. Dr. Marlin began taking a longer route on his evening walks, one that brought him past the schoolhouse just before the oil lamps were snuffed out. From the road, he could see Mr. Finch at his desk, still in his waistcoat, sleeves rolled to the forearms, reading by the measured glow of a brass lantern. A cup of tea always sat to his right, untouched. Papers lay in piles before him, some open, some marked with little leather tabs, and all of them handled with surgical precision. At first glance, it resembled the harmless chaos of a dedicated teacher grading student work. But Marlin had graded essays before. This wasn't that. One night, just after a rain, he stood across the street under the sycamore tree and watched Finch lean over a stack of pages with a pencil in hand, writing margin notes in a crisp, looping script. Every few moments he would pause, gaze toward the ceiling as if reconstructing something in his mind, then return to his task with a peculiar intensity. What struck Marlin most was the pattern. There was no haste in Finch's movements, no idle doodling or signs of fatigue. Every mark seemed calculated. On his next house call, Marlin casually asked young Nora Chamberlain, a pale, clever girl of 13, what she had been learning in class. She spoke out Latin declensions and crop rotation, and when prompted, mentioned something called moral reflection. She described it as a private exercise. Mr. H. Finch asked them not to speak of it outside the classroom. "It helps us understand what kind of people we are," she said with surprising solemnity. "And what kind of person are you?" Marlin asked gently. Nora looked down. "Someone who needs watching," she murmured. That answer followed Marlin for days. A week later, he paid a social visit to his cousin Lydia, who taught Sunday school. Over tea, she shared an odd observation. One of her students, a boy named Matthew, had recently refused to say the Lord's Prayer. He said it didn't feel sincere unless he confessed what he had thought about the night before, she said, half smiling. I asked him what he meant, and he said, "Mr. Finch says truth without exposure is only pretense." Lydia frowned. It was strange, like he was quoting something he didn't fully understand. Marlin asked if she'd ever seen any of the students writing from Mr. Finch's class. She shook her head. "He collects it, keeps it all locked away. He says, privacy is essential for honesty." That same afternoon, Marlin walked past the schoolhouse and found the door ajar. He knocked out of politeness, then stepped inside when no answer came. The room smelled of chalk and oil. Desks were orderly. The floor swept. Mr. Finch's desk was the only cluttered space. Papers laid in neat stacks beside an iron-bound wooden box with a polished lock and no visible keyhole. He didn't touch it, but he noticed something that made him pause. A name written in the corner of a loose page. Jacob Tilling, the boy's name. The handwriting was slanted and uneven, the words small and tightly packed. Marlin didn't read the page, but he saw the title scrawled at the top. The thing I thought when I saw my father drunk. Just as he stepped back, he heard a floorboard creak. Finch was standing in the doorway, hat in hand, smiling faintly. "Dr. Marlin," he said, voice smooth as varnish. "What brings you by?" "I was passing through. Thought I'd see how the new schoolhouse was holding up, structurally or morally?" Finch asked. The smile deepened, not unkind. Marlin chuckled lightly, deflecting. "Both, I suppose." Finch stepped into the room, brushing rain from his shoulders. "I keep everything orderly. As you can see, it helps the children feel safe. Routine is the spine of discipline." "And the locked box." "Ah," Finch said, his eyes flicking to it. "That is my journal. I keep reflections of my own, just as the children do. It's only fair." Marlin nodded, but something in him curled. He recognized a practiced answer when he heard one. That night, he wrote a private note in his ledger. Finch reads the children's thoughts. He does not return their writings. He studies them. Why? He wasn't the only one asking questions. At the general store, a mother mentioned to another that her daughter had asked whether it was right to keep secrets from the people who teach her soul. A few of the older boys had begun holding reflection circles on Sundays, small groups where they came, sat quietly, eyes closed, until one of them decided to speak. Every few moments he would pause, gaze toward the ceiling as if reconstructing something in his mind, then return to his task with a peculiar intensity. What struck Marlin most was the pattern. There was no haste in Finch's movements, no idle doodling or signs of fatigue. Every mark seemed calculated. On his next house call, Marlin casually asked young Nora Chamberlain, a pale, clever girl of 13, what she had been learning in class. She spoke about Latin declensions and crop rotation, and when prompted, mentioned something called moral reflection. She described it as a private exercise. Mr. H. Finch asked them not to speak of it outside the classroom. "It helps us understand what kind of people we are," she said with surprising solemnity. "And what kind of person are you?" Marlin asked gently. Nora looked down. "Someone who needs watching," she murmured. That answer followed Marlin for days. A week later, he paid a social visit to his cousin Lydia, who taught Sunday school. Over tea, she shared an odd observation. One of her students, a boy named Matthew, had recently refused to say the Lord's Prayer. He said it didn't feel sincere unless he confessed what he had thought about the night before, she said, half smiling. I asked him what he meant, and he said, "Mr. Finch says truth without exposure is only pretense." Lydia frowned. It was strange, like he was quoting something he didn't fully understand. Marlin asked if she'd ever seen any of the students writing from Mr. Finch's class. She shook her head. "He collects it, keeps it all locked away. He says, privacy is essential for honesty." That same afternoon, Marlin walked past the schoolhouse and found the door ajar. He knocked out of politeness, then stepped inside when no answer came. The room smelled of chalk and oil. Desks were orderly. The floor swept. Mr. Finch's desk was the only cluttered space, papers laid in neat stacks beside an iron-bound wooden box with a polished lock and no visible keyhole. He didn't touch it, but he noticed something that made him pause. A name written in the corner of a loose page. Jacob Tilling, the boy's name. The handwriting was slanted and uneven, the words small and tightly packed. Marlin didn't read the page, but he saw the title scrawled at the top, "The Thing I Thought When I Saw My Father Drunk." Just as he stepped back, he heard a floorboard creak. Finch was standing in the doorway, hat in hand, smiling faintly. "Dr. Marlin," he said, voice smooth as varnish, "what brings you by?" "I was passing through. Thought I'd see how the new schoolhouse was holding up, structurally or morally?" Finch asked. The smile deepened, not unkind. Marlin chuckled lightly, deflecting, "Both, I suppose." Finch stepped into the room, brushing rain from his shoulders. "I keep everything orderly. As you can see, it helps the children feel safe. Routine is the spine of discipline." "And the locked box?" "Ah," Finch said, his eyes flicking to it. "That is my journal. I keep reflections of my own, just as the children do. It's only fair." Marlin nodded. but something in him curled. He recognized a practiced answer when he heard one. That night, he wrote a private note in his ledger. Finch reads the children's thoughts. He does not return their writings. He studies them. Why? He wasn't the only one asking questions. At the general store, a mother mentioned to another that her daughter had asked whether it was right to keep secrets from the people who teach her soul. A few of the older boys had begun holding reflection circles on Sundays, small groups where they came, sat quietly, eyes closed, until one of them decided to speak. No adults were invited. The most disturbing moment came during the monthly church potluck when 8-year-old Clara Bell stood to recite a memorized Bible verse and suddenly froze. Her lips trembled. Then, without warning, she said, "Sometimes I imagine pushing my baby brother off the stairs, not because I want to, but because the thought comes and I don't know how to make it leave." The church fell into horrified silence. Her mother rushed forward, mortified. Clara sobbed into her apron. Later, Finch approached Marlin outside the chapel and spoke as if nothing had happened. "Children speak the truth when they're given the right room," he said. "It's adults who learn to lie." Marlin stared at him. "That wasn't honesty," he said quietly. "That was distress." Finch looked out across the churchyard. "Perhaps, but you cannot extract virtue without exposing rot. The human soul does not grow in shadow." That night, Marlin passed the schoolhouse again. The lantern was lit, the trunk was open, and on Mr. Finch's desk, stacked high, were dozens of confession pages, each one carefully marked with dates, annotations, and names. By early October, the children of Briar Glen no longer seemed like children, at least not in the ways their parents remembered. There were still scraped knees and muddy boots, but something had shifted behind their eyes. They watched more than they played. They listened, not with curiosity, but with intent. Conversations at dinner became cautious affairs, where fathers hesitated before complaining about the preacher, and mothers thought twice before muttering about a neighbor's lack of charity. What no one fully understood, what they only began to suspect, was that the students had been given new assignments by Mr. Finch. They were to keep not only their own moral reflections, but observations of their households. Finch had framed it as an exercise in social awareness, a way for the young to understand the spiritual landscape in which they were raised. What patterns did they see in their parents' behavior? What contradictions between public virtue and private life? Were there moments when a mother's kindness faltered, when a father's silence felt loaded with shame? These were not essays. They were case studies. It was Marcus Bell, the Reverend's eldest son, who first revealed the scope of the assignment. He approached Mr. Finch after class and offered to present his family's habits, not in writing, but in a chart. Finch had smiled at the boy's initiative and granted permission. Marcus returned 2 days later with a detailed map of his family's routines, when they prayed, when they argued, how his father responded to sermons that included references to wrath or grace. "He flinches at grace," Marcus noted in small script. "Perhaps he doubts his own worthiness." When Finch read it, he said only, "Very good. You're learning to see the soul behind the skin." Other students followed suit. Some drew diagrams, others recorded overheard phrases in careful detail. A few included sketches, faces caught in moments of emotion, guilt, frustration, weariness. Finch never asked for this level of detail. He didn't need to. His praise alone guided them deeper. The students began referring to this as the second journal, though no such term had been formally introduced. It was different from the daily confessions. It was impersonal, clinical, more detached. Finch had trained them, perhaps unintentionally, to become observers of the human animal, particularly the human animal within their own walls. Dr. Marlin noticed the difference in his own niece, Anna, who often visited after school while her parents worked late at the feed mill. One afternoon, she sat in his study, legs swinging off the chair, watching him as he sorted his medical ledgers. He asked her what she'd learned in school. She told him they were studying systems, how people organize their time, how habits form. Everyone has patterns, she said. Mr. Finch says you can learn more about someone by what they repeat than what they say. Marlon looked up. What patterns have you noticed in me? Anna considered. You touch your forehead when you're worried, and you don't like it when people interrupt your quiet, like Kay, but you don't say so. You just sigh and wait. He chuckled, unsettled. And what does that tell you? She shrugged. You like control, but you pretend you don't. She returned to drawing a series of small boxes on her notebook, each labeled with initials. Family members, he assumed. Marlon felt a coldness stir beneath his ribs. Around town, subtle changes crept in like ivy. The Tor's son stopped attending social events, claiming he was studying his family. A farmer's daughter declined to join the harvest festival, saying she needed to review her notes. Conversations with children became oddly formal. They asked questions that sounded rehearsed. Have you ever lied to protect someone? Or do you think a person can be good and still hide things? One evening, a mother confronted her 12-year-old daughter about a private family matter that had somehow reached the ears of another parent. The girl grew pale and confessed she had written about it in her reflection journal. Mr. Finch, she insisted, had not told her to share it, but she felt that if she didn't, she would be hiding something from the truth itself. He says, secrets are the birthplace of sin, she whispered. Marlon began hearing the phrase from multiple students, truth must be seen to be redeemed. Then came the matter of Thomas Abernathy. Thomas, a quiet boy with a stutter, had written in his reflection journal about witnessing his uncle strike a hired man behind the stable. He hadn't told anyone else, fearing it would shame the family. But 2 days later, the hired man was dismissed without explanation. That Sunday, the uncle stood in front of the congregation and gave an impromptu testimony about hidden anger and the burden of repentance. When Marlon mentioned the coincidence to Reverend Bell, the man looked weary. I've had 5 families come to me in the past week, each confessing some matter. They say they realize through reflection, always the same phrasing. Do you think Finch is encouraging them? The Reverend hesitated. He's awakening something, certainly, but I fear he's stirring it too. A few days later, Marlon met a boy named Isaac who asked if it was wrong to imagine your parents not being your parents. Just to see how it would feel, the boy said. Mr. Ruck, Finch says we should test our attachments. Marlon pressed. Did he tell you that? Not exactly, but he says the truest thoughts are the ones we don't know how to say yet. At home, Marlon opened his journal and made a single entry. The children are being trained to study love without feeling it. It was on the last Monday of October when something finally cracked. The air in Briar Glen had grown heavy with that peculiar autumn hush when the fields are bare, the trees skeletal, and the silence of the land starts to press in like a waiting breath. At the schoolhouse, the routine remained as exacting as ever. Students arrived at 7:30 sharp, sat in rows with hands folded, and began the morning with reflection, just as Mr. Dyes, Finch required. But on that morning, one desk remained empty. Then 10 minutes into the hour, the door creaked open, and an 11-year-old Samuel Reed stepped inside, eyes forward, back straight. He walked to his desk and sat without apology. No nod to Finch, no explanation. Mr. Finch didn't acknowledge the delay. He simply moved down the rows with his usual quiet, lifting the written pages from each desk. When he reached Samuel's, he paused. There was no paper. Mr. Reed, Finch said softly. Have you forgotten your reflection? The room went still. No birdsong from outside, no scrape of boots, just the sound of breath held. Samuel met his teacher's eyes. I didn't write one. A long pause. Finch looked down at the boy, then crouched slightly to bring his face to Samuel's level. Why not? The boy swallowed. Because I didn't think anything bad this weekend, and I didn't want to make something up just to give you a page. Finch's expression remained unreadable. And is that the truth? Yes, sir. Finch straightened. Then your honesty is noted, but honesty requires discipline. You may step outside and stand until the morning session is finished." Samuel rose without protest. He walked out into the gray light, pulled the door closed behind him, and stood still on the front steps. The remaining students bent over their desks, their pencils scratching more urgently than usual. Marlon heard about it that afternoon. He had treated Mrs. Reed for a persistent cough and found her unusually quiet as he packed his kit. At the door, she asked, "Would you call it a sin if a child didn't feel guilty?" He turned. "Not necessarily." "Why?" She shook her head. "My Samuel, he said he felt peaceful all weekend, that nothing needed confessing. Mr. Finch sent him out like he was lying." Marlon said nothing, but his mind stirred. The next day, Samuel returned to class, but again handed in no reflection. This time, Finch dismissed him after roll call, not for discipline, but for realignment. The boy was to spend the day in silence at the back of the classroom, copying scripture, until his internal mirror becomes clear again, Finch explained. By Friday, Samuel was no longer in school at all. His parents claimed they were keeping him home for rest. But those who passed the Reed farm reported seeing the boy walking the fields alone, shoulders hunched, muttering to himself. One neighbor claimed she overheard him repeating, "It doesn't mean I'm hiding something. It doesn't." Another said she'd seen Mr. Finch visit the Reed house late one evening and speak with the family for nearly an hour. What they discussed was never shared. But after that visit, Samuel's father began attending church twice on Sundays and refused to shake hands with anyone. Dr. Marlon grew increasingly disturbed. He began documenting small details with obsessive precision, phrases he overheard from students at the market, expressions on parents' faces when Finch's name was mentioned, even the routes children took home from school. He noticed they no longer walked in groups. Instead, they drifted home separately, as if needing solitude to process something that couldn't be spoken aloud. One evening, he passed the schoolhouse later than usual and caught a glimpse of Mr. Finch through the open window. The teacher was alone, surrounded by student reflections. But what shocked Marlon was not the volume of papers. It was the second trunk beside Finch's desk, slightly open, filled with folders labeled not with student names, but family surnames. Each folder, it seemed, contained notes. He was building profiles. That Sunday, Reverend Bell delivered a sermon on confession and its place in salvation. He quoted scripture with his usual gravitas, but several families sat stiffer than usual. A child coughed uncontrollably during the closing prayer and was rushed out by her mother. Marlon noticed Marcus Bell, the Reverend's own son, taking notes in a small black booklet as the congregation filed out. "Recording impressions," the boy said when Marlon asked. "Mr. Finch says the soul often reveals itself most clearly in quiet moments." Marlon turned to the Reverend. "And you're comfortable with that?" The old man's smile was one. "These children know more about our lives than we know about theirs." That evening, Marlon visited the Reed home. He found Samuel sitting by the hearth, pale, thinner than he remembered. The boy looked up but said nothing. Marlon asked to speak with him alone. The parents agreed reluctantly. "I heard you stopped writing," Marlon said gently. Samuel nodded. There was nothing to write. But now Samuel looked toward the window. "Now I think of things just to have something to say. I imagine bad things. I write them down before I can stop them." "Who told you to do that?" "Nobody." The boy's voice trembled. "But if I don't, it means I'm hiding." Dr. Marlon left the house with a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain. He realized, as he stepped into the cold night, that Finch's genius wasn't in the reflections themselves. It was in making silence feel like deceit. Dr. Marlon began to keep 2 sets of notes. One remained in his clinic ledger, where he recorded patients' symptoms, prescriptions, and household concerns. The second was stored in a locked drawer beneath his desk, a separate journal with no dates, only observations. He labeled people not by name but by role: the seamstress whose son no longer speaks freely, the preacher with a watching boy, the widow who receives Finch on Wednesdays. The entries accumulated quickly. What disturbed him most wasn't what Mr. Finch was doing in the open. It was what he'd made invisible. Since the introduction of reflection, the town had become quieter, but not in the way that peace quiets. It was the stillness of a hunted animal, ears pricked, breath shallow. People seemed to second-guess themselves in the middle of sentences, trailing off when a child entered the room. Marlin saw it in the pharmacy line, at the butcher's stall, even during Sunday service, a whole town beginning to speak like it feared being overheard. One morning, while treating a mild fever at the home of Mr. Abram Fletcher, a respected millwright with 3 children, Marlin spotted a stack of papers tucked beneath a corner of a doily on the side table. The corner of one page bore the same narrow, slanted script he had seen on the schoolhouse desk. A single line was visible. Father avoids prayer before dinner. Possible guilt. Repeated pattern. 5 days in a row. Marlin said nothing. He placed the thermometer back into his case and left. He started visiting families under the pretense of medical concern, especially those with school-aged children. The symptoms were always vague enough to justify headaches, nervous stomach, trouble sleeping. Parents seemed relieved for the visits and often confessed quietly that their children had become more intense, more obedient, or less like themselves. Some even used the word changed. It wasn't long before Marlin confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The children weren't simply writing their own reflections. They were recording the lives of their parents, and not out of rebellion or spite, but with a cold, clinical devotion to truth. One mother admitted her daughter had asked to sit in the hallway during mealtime so she could observe family dynamics more clearly. A father confessed that his son had stopped saying goodnight and instead began concluding the day with the phrase, "I'll reflect on this tomorrow." The turning point came when Marlin interviewed Nathan Carraway, a 12-year-old boy with a sharp mind and a stiff posture, the kind children adopt when they sense their words matter. "What do you write about your family?" Marlin asked him gently. Nathan blinked. "Not about them, about patterns." "What kind of patterns? Which sins repeat? Which ones are unspoken?" Mr. Finch says, "The worst lies are the ones we don't notice because we've lived with them too long." "And what happens when you notice them?" Nathan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You name them, and once they're named, you don't belong to them anymore." Later that evening, Marlin passed by the schoolhouse just as the sun dipped beneath the ridge. A dim light still glowed from within. Unable to resist, he approached and peered through the cracked shutter. Finch sat alone at his desk, meticulously transcribing from one stack of paper to another. Each new sheet bore a heading, family surnames in alphabetical order. Marlin caught sight of his own: Marlin, Seth, father, Elizabeth, wife, and a niece. He stepped back from the window as if burned. Finch wasn't just reading the students' reflections. He was compiling dossiers, family profiles. Each child's observations had been distilled, categorized, and indexed. The schoolhouse had become a private archive of the town's unfiltered secrets. He began to suspect the deeper truth. The entire educational program was a facade. Reflection wasn't a tool for moral development. It was an extraction method, a net cast across Briar Glen, baited with approval and shame, drawing in every buried weakness, every private compromise. And the children weren't victims, they were instruments. The better they observed, the more Finch praised them. The more guilt they unearthed, the more they were told they were brave, and the families, unaware, fed the system willingly. At a supper the following week, Marlin tested a theory. He asked his niece Anna what she thought of his patient, Dr. Kingsley, the retired surgeon who still lived on the east side. She replied, "He keeps the shutters drawn even in the afternoon, and he doesn't look people in the eye. Do you think that means something?" Anna paused. "I think he's hiding shame. Mr. Finch says people who fear being seen fear being known." "And how do you feel about Dr. Kingsley?" She frowned. "I used to like him, but now I'm not sure if that was honest." Marlin's chest tightened. She wasn't repeating Finch's ideas, she was internalizing them. He excused himself after dinner, feigning fatigue, and returned to his study. There he wrote a single sentence across a fresh page in his second journal. He is not building better children. He is building an intelligence network. It had rained the previous 2 nights, but by Thursday the clouds had thinned and the wind came sharp out of the north, shaking the shutters and laying frost across the porch rails by morning. Dr. Marlin waited until the church bell struck 10 before moving. The town was asleep, or nearly so, and the path from his house to the schoolhouse was dry enough for quiet steps. He carried no lantern, only a pair of gloves and a skeleton key, once used by the township council to access the old church cellar, one of the few things he'd kept after the 1851 typhoid outbreak, when every building in Briar Glen had served as quarantine space. He knew the layout of the schoolhouse well. There was a side entrance used mostly by the custodian whose duties had ceased when Mr. Finch arrived. Finch cleaned the building himself, tended the stove, repaired his own broken chairs. No one else had been inside the school after hours since the term began. The door opened without resistance. The lock was stiff but old. Inside the air was laced with oil, wood smoke, and the faintest trace of ink and parchment. Marlin stepped carefully, not daring to strike a match. He let his eyes adjust. Moonlight streamed in through the high windows, casting long bands across the rows of desks. The room looked ordinary at first glance, silent, orderly, asleep. But on the far side, behind Finch's massive oak desk, stood the trunk. It was larger than Marlin remembered. It had 2 locks this time. One built into the brass hardware, the other a leather strap with a buckle and hasp. Around it, stacked in fan-like symmetry, were folders labeled meticulously. He bent to look. Calder, Fitzroy, Reed, Donlin, each bearing subheadings in neat practiced ink, observed weaknesses, inferred guilt patterns, interpersonal dynamics. He opened one at random. Read. Inside were several sheets of handwritten text, clearly not in Finch's hand. Children's writing, likely Samuel's. But each page had been annotated with margin notes like potential shame, leverage via paternal expectation, and conscience malleable, responds strongly to moral framing. There was more. A chart, a crude hand-drawn diagram connecting names with arrows, Samuel to his mother, to his cousin at the mill, to Reverend Bell through church attendance. The arrows bore labels, emotional dependence, trust pathway, ideological access. This wasn't just observation. It was mapping. He closed the folder and opened another. Fitzroy. Same pattern. Notes, excerpts. A different child's handwriting, but identical in method. One reflection read, "Sometimes I hope my father doesn't come home from the tavern. Not because I hate him, but because everything feels easier when he's gone." Beside it, Finch had written, "Emotional relief tied to absence tests separation threshold." Marlin felt his pulse thrum in his throat. He turned to the trunk. It was sealed, but a smaller drawer beneath Finch's desk, hidden behind a sliding panel, sat half open. Inside was what appeared to be an index. Names, dates, keywords. A catalog of sin categorized not by offense but by psychological response. Shame, pride, fear, longing, apathy. Each cross-referenced with strategies. Guilt amplification, isolation, enhancement, attachment, severance. It was not theory, it was procedure. Behind him a floorboard creaked. Marlin froze, then slowly turned. No one but the silence had changed. Before it had been stillness, now it was awareness, as if the building itself had noticed him. He gathered his nerves and took one final document, a sheet tucked beneath the others, marked in red ink. Pilot phase complete. Candidate profiles sufficient for expansion. Underneath, a line chilled him to the bone. Replication feasible in larger population centers. Codify method under revised title, Pedagogical Immersion Model. He slipped it into his coat. Then, without a sound, he exited the building and returned home, locking the page in his desk and pouring himself a measure of cold tea with hands that trembled. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring into the black trees, trying to make sense of what he'd uncovered. This was not an educator, not a reformer. This was something older and colder, a man who saw the human conscience not as sacred, but as pliable, and worse still, he was succeeding. Marlin began his circuit quietly. He chose his first conversations carefully. Families he trusted, people who wouldn't dismiss him as paranoid or meddling. It was not a small thing to accuse a teacher, especially one so universally admired. Finch had become a kind of moral anchor in Briar Glen. He attended church, offered books to the library fund, spoke at town meetings about the virtues of education and restraint. He was articulate, generous, and precise. He was also terrifying. The first home he visited belonged to Elias Donlin, a Wright with 3 sons and a practical mind. They spoke by the barn while the boys were at school. "Have you noticed anything odd in your boys lately?" Marlin asked. Elias squinted, wary but curious. "They're quiet, more polite, but sometimes I feel like they're looking at me the way I look at faulty timber, like they're trying to figure out where the crack is." He paused. "Jacob asked me last week if I'd ever cheated someone on a sale, just out of nowhere." "And have you?" "That's not the point," Elias snapped, then softened. "The point is," he asked it like he already knew the answer. Marlin nodded slowly. "I believe they're being trained to find weakness." Elias's face darkened. "You think they're being taught to spy?" "No," Marlin said. "I think they're being conditioned to believe that watching is virtuous, that knowing everything about everyone is a moral act." Other conversations followed. A farmer's wife confided that her daughter no longer hugged her good night. "She just stands in the doorway and asks if I've ever thought about running away. Not from her, from my whole life." Another parent confessed that his youngest son had started keeping a second journal, one the boy refused to show anyone. "He said it's private, but he told me Mr. Finch said it's where the real truth lives." It was clear now. The students had been weaponized not with hatred but with analysis, not with rebellion but with righteous distance. And then came the second revelation. It began with a seamstress named Mrs. Adele Monroe, who visited the clinic for a sore hip and left with a story. "I've been asked to write reports," she said suddenly after the examination was over. "Reports about the families I work for. Mr. Finch said I have a unique position moving between homes. He said I notice things no one else does." Her eyes darted toward the door. "He pays me for it. Not much, but enough." Marlin kept his voice steady. "What kind of things?" "Habits, quarrels, what people eat, who doesn't sleep well, what wives say about their husbands when no one else is in the room." She flushed with shame. At first it felt harmless. Observations. But now he waited. He asked if I'd noticed signs of guilt in the Bell family, if their son ever seemed emotionally burdened. He said it was for an academic study. I wanted to believe him. She wasn't alone. In the weeks that followed, Marlin discovered a dozen others: servants, stable boys, shopkeepers, even the assistant postmaster, who had been approached by Finch under similar pretexts. He offered each of them a variation on the same explanation. "You are uniquely positioned to help humanity understand itself," and to each he gave specific instructions on what to record. "I thought he just wanted to write a book," one man said, wringing his cap in his hands. He called it anthropological work, like he was studying tribes. "He made me feel like I mattered," said another, "like I was helping something bigger than gossip." But it was more than data collection. Marlin saw it clearly. Now Finch was building a model, a layered, living system of emotional surveillance, with the children as the first tier and the adults as the second. Every corner of Briar Glen was being mapped, not just where people lived, but how they behaved when no one was looking, except someone always was. Marlin's greatest fear crystallized one rainy evening as he walked home along the river path. He paused beneath a broken willow to collect his thoughts and realized the implications. This wasn't a passive archive. Finch wasn't merely storing these truths. He was using them. That would explain the confessions in church, the sudden apologies, the abrupt reconciliations, and the uncharacteristic self-exile of several families. He wasn't threatening anyone, at least not openly. He didn't need to. The guilt was already in them. All he had to do was shine a light and step back. But why? What end was served by pressing people into emotional exposure? What benefit came from turning every eye inward until nothing remained but doubt? He didn't have the answer yet, but he knew who might. Marcus Bell. Marlin waited until the first frost settled on the garden walls before visiting the Bell household. He knew Reverend Bell would be at evening prayer with the elders, and Mrs. Bell rarely left her sewing room after dark. That left Marcus alone, likely in the parlor, where he often read before the hearth, always dressed too formally for a boy his age. The door opened after the second knock. Marcus stood in his usual vest and collar, book in hand. His eyes showed no surprise, only polite calculation. "Good evening, Doctor. I was hoping we could talk." Marcus stepped aside without hesitation. "Of course." The fire crackled softly in the hearth. A candle burned beside a stack of annotated texts, Seneca, Thucydides, some volume on ecclesiastical jurisprudence. Marlin had to remind himself. The boy was just 16. "I've been speaking with several families," he began carefully, "trying to understand some of the changes I've been seeing around town." Marcus nodded. "I've noticed them, too." "You and Mr. Finch are close, aren't you?" A small smile. "He says I'm a promising thinker." "What does that mean to him?" Marcus placed his book aside. "It means I can see people clearly without the noise of emotion clouding the facts." Marlin studied him. "You don't find that troubling?" "No," Marcus said. "I find it freeing. Most people cling to illusions because the truth scares them. Mr. Finch says truth isn't what comforts us. It's what burns away what we don't need. Even if what's burned is a family, a belief, a person's trust in themselves." Marcus looked at the fire. If it wasn't strong enough to survive the truth, maybe it wasn't worth keeping. The words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded internalized. Marlin leaned forward. "Have you ever lied in your reflections?" Marcus met his gaze. "No." "Have you ever left something out? Not because it wasn't true, but because you knew what Mr. Finch would see in it." There was a pause, a brief flicker. "I've been tempted to," Marcus admitted, "but I try not to. He sees omissions. That's part of the work." "The work?" Marlin echoed. "What exactly is that work, Marcus? Do you know what he's building?" Marcus hesitated. "He's showing us that shame can be studied, that fear and guilt have patterns. He believes they can be mapped, predicted, used to guide behavior toward higher integrity." Marlin's voice dropped. "Or toward obedience." Marcus blinked slowly. He says, "Obedience without understanding is tyranny, but understanding without structure is chaos." What he's doing is structure. "And what are you doing, Marcus?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he rose and opened a small cabinet beside the hearth. From within, he withdrew a leather notebook. He handed it to Marlin without ceremony. "I've been documenting my parents," he said, "as part of the secondary study." Marlin opened the book. It was meticulous. Detailed descriptions of his father's expressions during sermons, emotional shifts in his mother's voice during prayer, notations on the frequency of arguments, moments of silence after meals, variations in household rituals. Near the end, Marlin found a section labeled Instability Indicators. Underneath, he read, open quote, "Father's tone grows brittle when sermons address doubt. Mother's eyes flick toward door when brother's name is mentioned. Both show signs of unresolved grief over Elijah. Deceased hypothesis. Emotional denial is core feature of family narrative." Close quote. His hands shook slightly as he turned the pages. "Do they know you're doing this?" "No. And if they found out," Marcus looked away, "they'd be hurt. But that doesn't make the patterns false." Marlin closed the notebook. "You've stopped seeing them as people." Marcus frowned. "I see them as clearly as I see you. Isn't that the point of reflection?" "No," Marlin said quietly. "The point of reflection is to understand yourself, not to turn your family into test subjects." Marcus's voice was calm. "Then maybe the problem is that most people don't want to be understood." Silence settled again. The candle sputtered. Finally, Marlin asked, "What would happen if you stopped writing?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'd fall behind. I'd miss the next layer." "What layer?" "The part where we stop needing forgiveness to grow. The part where the truth becomes neutral, just data, just structure." Marlin stood slowly. As he stepped toward the door, Marcus said one final thing. Mr. Finch says Briar Glen is a proving ground, that if it works here, it can work anywhere. Marlin turned. What does it mean, Marcus? The boy's eyes reflected firelight, steady and unblinking. The system. The second time Marlin broke into the schoolhouse, he did not do it with curiosity. He did it with purpose. There was no illusion of innocence. Now, no doubt that Finch was orchestrating something far greater than an experiment in education. This time, Marlin needed proof. Not fragments, not impressions, but something undeniable, something that could stop what was spreading. He waited until the town lay deep in frost. When the horses were stabled and the lamps dimmed behind drawn curtains, he moved quickly, silently, letting himself in through the cellar this time, where the old coal furnace still sat cold and rusted. A narrow stairway led up to the main floor. He emerged in the cloakroom behind the classroom, the scent of oiled wood and scorched ink thick in the air. The desks were as they always were, symmetrical, immaculate, untouched. But on Finch's side of the room, behind the heavy desk, was the cabinet he had seen once before, the one with the double locks. It now had a third. Marlin hesitated only briefly before producing a set of tools he had borrowed from a retired locksmith on the pretense of mending his cellar latch. The first two locks gave way with tension and patience. The third, a recessed latch beneath a false hinge, took longer, but when it finally snapped open, the weight of the cabinet's lid made a soft groan as it rose. Inside were dozens of folders, sealed envelopes, and bound ledgers. But in the center, lying atop the others like a relic, was a volume unlike the rest. Thicker, older, bound in black leather, too fine to be local. Its cover read simply, The Atlas. He opened it carefully. The pages were covered in columns, diagrams, marginalia, and hand-drawn charts. But this was not a journal. It was a manual. The opening page was titled, Codified Framework for the Isolation, Amplification, and Collapse of Moral Identity. Trial Model, Rural Protestant Community. Beneath it, compiled by T. Finch with annotations from EDS and GT. Marlin turned the page. There were sections. Ideal subjects, youth age 9 to 16, preferably with strong religious conditioning. Subjects exhibiting heightened sensitivity to approval and shame, high parent-child dependence, encouraged. 2. Phase 1, confession, conditioning. Establish safe environment for expression. Introduce moral vocabulary. Reinforce the equation, expression equals purification. 3. Phase 2, externalization of analysis. Encourage observation of family units. Reframe attention as moral awareness. Introduce reward system for precision in emotional interpretation. For Phase 3, fragmentation of loyalty. Shift subjects' loyalty from family to system. Undermine authority of emotional bonds through empirical doubt. Normalize detachment as maturity. Phase 4, reprogramming through exposure. Allow subjects to witness psychological collapse in others. Reinforce that unexamined guilt equals instability. Introduce the idea that the system never fails, only the dishonest do. Marlin's throat felt dry. He flipped forward. There were case studies, each labeled by town name, year, and outcome. Greystone Hollow, 1853, partial success. Subject resistance moderate, system fidelity 67%. Note, rejected by council due to overt parental revolt. Briar Glen, 1859, full implementation underway, resistance level low, system fidelity 84%. Note, candidate MB, Marcus Bell, demonstrating exceptional integration. He turned another page and found a section titled Suggested Improvements for Urban Scaling. Replace moral language with civic ethics. Use mentorship model instead of teacher-student. Introduce written contracts of reflection as public proof of growth. Embed data collection within health and education frameworks. Marlin stepped back from the desk. It was too much. Not just the scale of the plan, but the coldness of its logic. There was no hatred in these pages, only design. It was a machine built to replicate the dismantling of belief, faith, family, even self through process. He flipped to the final page. There, in Mr. Finch's unmistakable hand, was a single line. The soul is not sacred. It is an arrangement. All arrangements can be disassembled. He took the atlas. He closed the cabinet, and as he stepped outside, the wind pressed cold against his face, and he thought not of the stars overhead, but of how terrifyingly easy it was to replace one form of worship with another. Marlin didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study with the atlas open before him, the fireplace reduced to coals, the lamps low. Each page he reread only solidified the conclusion. Finch had never come to Briar Glen to educate. He had come to test a theory, and the children had become levers to pry apart the seams of an entire community. Worse still, Finch was not alone. The initials EDHS, SGT were not abbreviations of methods. They were collaborators. Somewhere beyond this quiet town, others were studying the collapse of conscience with the same calm curiosity. At dawn, Marlin packed the atlas into a canvas satchel and walked to the schoolhouse. Lynch was already there. He always was. The man greeted him at the door with that same composed smile, as if he'd been expecting a visitor. He wore no coat despite the cold, only a vest and shirt sleeves neatly pressed. His eyes flicked to the bag at Marlin's side, but he didn't mention it. "Doctor," he said, "have you come with questions?" "No," Marlin replied. "I've come for answers." Finch stepped aside. "Then let's speak plainly." They sat opposite each other at the desk, the atlas placed between them like a chalice. Finch didn't reach for it. He folded his hands and waited. "I know what this is," Marlin said. "I know what you've done here." Finch tilted his head, not in denial, but in careful study. "Then perhaps you also know why it had to be done." "No one had to be undone," Marlin said. "No one had to be broken to prove a theory." Finch's voice remained soft. "They weren't broken. They were revealed by their own children." Finch nodded. "Who better to see the truth? Children possess honesty unpolluted by the compromises of adulthood. The shame they observe is real. The tension, the contradictions, those things shape their moral universe long before they're taught to ignore them. You used them. I guided them." Marlin's voice grew tight. "You turned them into tools." Finch smiled, not kindly. "Tools build, tools dismantle, but either way they create change." Marlin leaned forward. "What is the purpose? Tell me why this town? Why these people?" Finch's fingers tapped lightly against the wood grain. "Because they were untouched. Because they believed they were good. Guilt is most interesting when it hides inside virtue." Briar Glen was the perfect place to prove that the human soul is an unstable fiction held together only by routine and ritual. Remove the comfort, the illusion of privacy, and it unravels. He paused. "We didn't break anyone, Doctor. We simply invited them to speak aloud what they were already carrying." "You dismantled a town," Marlin said. "We exposed its design flaws and what comes after." Finch looked at him, eyes alight with something that wasn't madness but conviction, reconstruction. "Elsewhere, with better data, we refine the system. We scale it." Marlin reached into the satchel and drew out the atlas. He opened it to the center to the page titled Phase 3, Fragmentation of Loyalty. "Do you even care what happens to them afterward?" he asked. Finch leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "Doctor, your question assumes there is an afterward that matters. What matters is that they learned, that they saw, that their lives will never again be built on assumptions, that even in suffering they found clarity." Marlin closed the book. "You speak like someone who's never been loved." Finch's face didn't change. "Love is the final illusion." "No," Marlin said. Love is the only thing that makes the truth survivable." They sat in silence. Outside, the wind pressed against the panes. The schoolhouse creaked softly, a living thing. "I could show this to the council," Marlin said, "to the reverend, to every parent in this town." Finch nodded slowly. "You could. They'd understand what you've done." "They might," Finch said. "But the question is, would it matter? Can they unsee what they now suspect? Could they trust their children again the way they did before? Could they trust themselves?" Marlin stared at him. Finch went on. "This system doesn't require me anymore. That's the brilliance of it. It replicates in thought, in habit, in silence. Even if I leave, the children will still write. They'll still observe. They'll still ask questions their parents can't answer. And the doubt will bloom. Marlin rose. He left the atlas on the desk. Finch watched him with no alarm, only something close to admiration. "You're a man of conscience," he said. "That's rare." Marlin turned at the door. "And you're a man without one. That's dangerous." Then he left. That evening, Marlin stood in front of the fireplace with a tin of kerosene in one hand and the atlas in the other. He'd brought it home after the meeting with Finch, unable to let it sit one moment longer in the hands of its creator. The book lay on the mantel now, its spine dark and perfectly straight, as if unaware of the lives it had catalogued and nudged toward collapse. He could burn it right now. Reduce it to ash the way heretics had once burned books and kings had burned laws. It would feel satisfying, decisive. But would it change anything? He stared into the fire, watching the flames writhe and settle. Flames that could consume an entire philosophy in seconds and still fail to touch the minds already shaped by it. He thought of Anna, his niece, and the way she now watched the world with quiet assessment, as if measuring every adult interaction for hidden truths. He thought of Marcus Bell and how he'd spoken phrases so deeply grafted from Finch's vocabulary. They no longer felt like the words of a boy. He thought of Samuel Reed, who had stopped writing reflections and had paid for it in silence and isolation. Even if the atlas burned, the children would not forget what they had learned. The system no longer required its architect. The next morning, he began visiting homes again, not as a doctor, but as a neighbor. He knocked gently, asked to speak with the parents, and told them plainly what he had discovered. Some listened, some bristled, and a few denied it entirely, but most said nothing at all. They nodded slowly, their eyes hollowing as he spoke. And by the end, they looked not surprised, but exhausted, like people who had been waiting for someone to confirm a suspicion too painful to name. At the fourth home, he found a mother who had torn her daughter's journal into shreds and locked her in her room for 2 days. At the seventh, a father confessed that his son had begun standing outside his bedroom door at night, listening. By the 10th, Marlin realized that fear had overtaken outrage. No one wanted to confront Finch, not because they doubted his guilt, but because they doubted their ability to undo what he'd already done. That Sunday, Reverend Bell delivered a sermon titled "The Eye That Watches." He spoke of false prophets and the danger of moral certainty that doesn't begin in humility. He did not mention Finch. He didn't have to. Most of the children sat motionless, their expressions blank. Marcus was not among them. Marlin found him later that afternoon, seated alone behind the chapel light, notebook in lap. "Still writing?" Marlin asked. Marcus looked up. "I'm refining." "Refining what? The model?" "For myself," he said simply. Marlin sat beside him. "Do you believe in anything anymore, Marcus?" The boy paused. "I believe in clarity." "And do you think clarity makes you good?" Marcus didn't answer. Marlin watched him for a while. Then he said, "You don't have to continue. You're allowed to stop." "No one's stopping me," Marcus replied. "Which means I'm free, or it means no one's watching anymore," Marlin said. "And you don't know how to be without being seen." The boy turned the page, said nothing. That night, the schoolhouse burned. No one claimed responsibility. No one saw who struck the match. But by morning, the roof had collapsed, and the records, journals, desks, and books were ash. The children stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the smoke rise, their faces unreadable. Finch was gone. He had left hours before the fire on foot, carrying nothing but a leather satchel. No note, no farewell, only a silence that seemed to echo long after he disappeared over the ridge. In the weeks following the fire, Briar Glen was quieter than ever. Not the silence of peace, but of recalibration, the kind that settles in after something invisible has shifted beneath the town's foundation. People still attended church, the store still opened, the horses still needed shoeing, and the harvest still had to be stored before the ground froze. But conversations became cautious, even among friends. It wasn't Finch they feared, it was each other. The children returned home full-time. Some resumed chores, others retreated into books or silence. The reflection journals, those that hadn't been burned by parents, disappeared from sight, but their influence lingered in the air like smoke long after the fire was gone. The youngest children forgot most quickly. The older ones did not. A few parents tried to restore order. They imposed strict household rules, reasserted curfews, and removed anything that resembled a confession ritual. But these gestures felt brittle, too little, too late. The power had already transferred. The children had learned how to see their elders with detachment, how to watch them as if from a distance. You can't undo that with extra chores and morning prayers. Marlin watched all of it unfold with growing weight in his chest. He had saved the town from its architect, yes, but not from the architecture. He resumed his medical rounds, now greeted by weary smiles. A few families thanked him quietly. One father shook his hand for too long and said nothing at all, but most avoided the subject entirely. The system had collapsed, yet the shadows it cast remained lodged in people's habits like the echo of a sound no longer playing. He asked Anna one day if she still reflected. She nodded. "But just for me, do you still write about us?" She hesitated. "Not like before." "What does that mean?" "It means I don't pretend I'm not watching, but I don't pretend it's objective either." The nuance stunned him. She was only 13. Others had changed in more troubling ways. One boy no longer spoke unless asked a direct question. A girl began keeping a log of every time someone in her household contradicted themselves. She called it her truth index. Marcus Bell, once Finch's star pupil, walked alone most days, no longer speaking in the philosophical tones that had once impressed adults. He seemed neither ashamed nor proud, only emptied. The schoolhouse was never rebuilt. Some whispered it was cursed. Others said it should be preserved as a warning, though there was little left to preserve beyond scorched earth and twisted iron. The town council eventually agreed to seed wild flowers over the space in spring to reclaim it with beauty. No one argued, but the conversations at council meetings grew more formal, more procedural. Trust had evaporated. Not in a single dramatic event, but in thousands of small private ruptures. A wife who no longer confided in her husband. A father who stopped reading aloud to his sons. A churchgoer who changed pews without explanation. They were still neighbors, but they were no longer certain who had ever been listening. Marlin kept the atlas despite everything in him telling him to destroy it. He hid it in the hollow space behind the clinic's hearth, wrapped in oiled cloth, sealed in a tin box. Not because he wanted to use it, but because he feared someone else would come looking for it, and because a part of him knew the world would not remain unaware of what had happened in Briar Glen forever. One afternoon, as the snow began to fall and the year edged toward its final breath, Marlin stood atop the schoolhouse ruins and looked out at the town. A single question echoed in his mind. Had they been manipulated, or had they merely been seen too clearly? Winter came hard that year. The ground froze deeper than it had in a decade, and wind cut through the trees with a voice that sounded at times almost like breath. The town folded into itself, windows shuttered, footsteps muted under snow, and gatherings thinned to only what necessity demanded. For most in Briar Glen, it was a season of waiting. Waiting for warmth, waiting for normalcy, waiting perhaps for forgetting. But Marlin couldn't forget. Not because he held on to what Finch had done, but because he had started to see things he couldn't explain in himself. He noticed how often he hesitated before speaking, how carefully he weighed each phrase, even with Anna, even with patients he'd known for years. He'd once prided himself on his candor, his ability to speak plainly and gently at once. But now, before every sentence, he found himself scanning for hidden signals. Would this be misinterpreted? Would this contradict something I've said before? Was this a truth or just a defense dressed as honesty? He began to keep a journal not like the children's, but something closer to it than he cared to admit. Notations, emotions tracked, moments of doubt indexed. I noticed a few small typos in your original, like a churchgoer lowercase, normally normalcy, atop, patience. So I kept the meaning intact but corrected them for accuracy. He told himself it was for clarity, but some nights he found himself writing lines he had no memory of thinking. I watched myself today. I didn't like the way I laughed when I was uncertain. It felt dishonest. I told the child her cough was nothing to worry about. I knew that wasn't entirely true. Why didn't I say more? Does healing people make me feel moral or superior? Or is there a difference anymore? One evening, he caught himself repeating a phrase aloud, clarity over comfort. He stopped mid-sentence. It was Finch's language. He slammed the journal shut. The next morning, he burned it in the stove, watched the pages curl black, then fold inward like withering leaves. But the act didn't bring relief, only a hollowing. He began to wonder, was Finch right? Not about the ethics. Marlin knew manipulation when he saw it, but about the frailty of what people called the self. Was identity truly so thin-skinned? Could it be peeled away simply by asking the right questions? With enough repetition and no place to hide, he had watched as good people folded. But maybe it wasn't Finch's doing. Maybe Finch had only removed the blindfold. One sleepless night, Marlin walked through town in a snowstorm, coat drawn tight, boots slicing clean prints behind him. He passed darkened windows where he knew children now dreamed more of structure than of stories. He passed the chapel where the cross had been replaced weeks earlier with a new lantern, one that never seemed to go out. He passed the bell house. Inside, Marcus sat at the front window. He wasn't writing. He wasn't reading. He was simply watching. Their eyes met through glass. Neither flinched. And Marlin understood in that moment that some part of the system had seated itself in both of them, not as belief, but as formatting. They had learned to think in terms of confession, suspicion, and observation. It was a fluency they had never wanted but could no longer unlearn. He wondered if that was the system's truest goal, not control, not obedience, but imprinting, to build a mind that couldn't go back to innocence. That night, he dreamed of the schoolhouse whole again. Inside it, rows of adults sat at desks, writing furiously. Their children stood at the front, reading from the atlas aloud, and Finch sat in the back row, smiling, silent, watching no one but being watched by all. The letter arrived in early spring, folded neatly within a plain brown envelope, no return address. The handwriting was precise, narrow, and unfamiliar. It was delivered not through the post, but slipped under Marlin's clinic door overnight, an intrusion both small and deeply unsettling. The envelope contained 3 things: a short note, a bundle of copied pages tied with a red string, and a single photograph, sepia-toned, faded, but unmistakably featuring Thaddeus Finch, years younger, standing in front of a different schoolhouse. The note read, "You are not alone. If you are reading this, then what happened to us has begun to happen to you. Burn nothing, study everything. They never stop. They only relocate." There was no name, only a town written at the bottom. Ashgrove, Vermont, 1854. Marlin sat for hours that morning reading through the enclosed documents. They appeared to be personal testimonies, statements written by a group of parents, physicians, and clergy in Ashgrove, describing nearly identical events to those that had unfolded in Briar Glen. A teacher had arrived, charming, educated, composed. A new curriculum had been introduced, focused on introspection, self-examination, and ethical confession. The children had been encouraged to write private thoughts, then to observe their families, then to document patterns, and then came the fracture. Children withdrawing, families unraveling, moral authority transferring from parent to instructor, from tradition to structure, from feeling to framework. Sound familiar? It was, word for word, the same design. The testimonies grew darker toward the end. One spoke of a boy who had stopped speaking entirely after being told he had no more layers left to excavate. Another described a family whose eldest daughter convinced her siblings to leave home in the middle of the night, claiming that truth demanded sacrifice. Their bodies were never found. At the bottom of the final testimony, a single phrase had been scrawled by hand. He left the moment resistance became visible. Marlin placed the bundle beside the atlas. The similarities were not coincidental. They were deliberate. Finch had practiced this before, and if the note was to be believed, he was not alone in this, either in action or in ideology. That night, Marlin opened his old field journal, the one he had used during the cholera outbreak years prior, and began a new section titled Pattern Recognition, Finch Doctrine, Observed Indicators. He listed the stages as he now understood them. Charismatic educator enters under guise of reform. System of moral confession introduced. Loyalty slowly redirected from family to abstract ideals. Children trained to observe, record, and interpret behavior. Community becomes destabilized through voluntary exposure. Authority figures discredited through engineered transparency. Departure occurs. Once methodology is complete, cycle resumes elsewhere. He sat back. 8 steps, clean, predictable, repeatable. He thought about the initials in the atlas. EDHSGTT. How many others were out there? How many towns like Ashgrove and Briar Glen had been measured, tested, and left to disassemble themselves in silence? And more importantly, who would be next? In the days that followed, Marlin began assembling copies of the atlas of the Ashgrove testimonies of his own notes. He sealed them in wax packets and labeled them with names of physicians, educators, and pastors he had met at conferences over the years. He mailed 5 to start, 1 to Pennsylvania, 1 to Illinois, 1 to upstate New York, 2 to Massachusetts. He did not ask them to act, only to notice. The rest would come later. He kept 1 copy for himself, because though Finch was gone, Marlin knew the design was still alive, quiet, precise, and always watching for a new structure to inhabit. By late spring, the frost had left the soil, and the trees surrounding Briar Glen bloomed with deceptive softness. New buds, new colors, new warmth in the air. None of it matched the town's internal climate. It had been months since Finch's departure, but the memory of his presence lingered like an aftertaste. It wasn't something the townspeople talked about anymore, not directly. They had, in the manner of people who could not confront a wound, sealed it beneath layers of routine, and yet it shaped them. The church remained full on Sundays, but now the prayers leaned more toward asking than praising. The children returned to chores and simpler games, but every now and then someone would catch them hesitating, staring too long at a parent's face, scribbling something in private, pausing as though waiting for a voice they could no longer hear. Marlin watched them with a strange mixture of grief and fascination. He had come to accept that some part of what Finch introduced had fused into the town's bones. Not the method itself, but the shift, the awakening. Once a person learns to dissect affection, to deconstruct authority, to examine love as if it were a formula, it becomes difficult to simply live inside it again. Still, the town endured, and Marlin endured with it. He continued his quiet correspondence with other strangers who had begun to write back cautiously, curiously. Some had never heard of Finch. Some had heard whispers, but all recognized the signs. They asked for more materials, for clarity, for language. So Marlin did what Finch had done. He built a structure not of manipulation, but of warning. He refined his observations, codified patterns, wrote case studies not to replicate, but to resist. He drafted letters designed not to alarm, but to prepare. He titled the collection simply The Arrangement. It wasn't published. It wasn't even copied more than a handful of times, but it traveled. 1 packet reached a small seminary in Virginia. Another found its way to a rural school district in Ohio. A third was left anonymously in the drawer of a courthouse judge in Connecticut. Marlin never knew what became of most of them. He didn't need to. It was enough that someone else would read the words and hesitate the next time a charming reformer arrived with a philosophy that sounded too perfect, too humane, too interested in the inner lives of other people's children. Years later, when his hands had grown too stiff to write and his eyes too dim to read without effort, Marlin sat on his porch and watched Anna, now a young woman, walk with her own son through the garden. The boy was laughing, unburdened. She had told Marlin once, not long after Finch left, that she'd kept one of her old reflection pages, just one, folded and hidden away in the false bottom of her jewelry box. Why? He'd asked. To remember how easy it is to mistake control for clarity, she'd said, and how seductive it is to feel seen by someone who doesn't love you. That was the lesson, Marlon realized. Not that evil wore a mask, but that it sometimes arrived wearing kindness, patience, and articulate intentions, offering not pain, but understanding. And that was why it was so dangerous. In the end, Marlon wrote one final letter. No address, no recipient. He simply left it in the hollow space behind the clinic hearth beside the last surviving copy of the atlas. The letter read, "To whoever finds this, there will always be another Finch, but there must also be someone watching for him, not with fear, but with clarity, because the moment you believe it can't happen again, it already has."